Hello, my name is Andrew Shankman. I'm a professor of history at Rutgers University in Camden, New Jersey. And today I'm going to be talking to you about the ideas that shaped the American Revolution and the expected and also unexpected consequences of taking those ideas seriously. So, in many ways, I think we all know what the core, most important, clearest, central idea of the American Revolution is. I can start the phrase, and I'm sure everybody listening to this will be able to finish it. We hold these truths to be self-evident that. We can all finish the phrase, right? All men are created equal. And what I want to suggest is that frease has become so trite and so well shop-worn, and we all can finish it and we all know it, that we kind of lose track of what it might have meant in the 18th century, in 1776, and how potentially transformative and radical and subversive that phrase could be. So let's think about it for a second. If we, in fact, accept that premise that all men, today we would say people, but all men are created equal, what we're saying is, in fact, what is the foundation for actually being able to believe in majority rule and democracy. If you think about it, why should a majority rule? A majority should rule only if every single person who's part of that population is equally capable of contributing and equal, and therefore should have an equal say. Only if that's the case is it significant that somebody can persuade a majority of those people to agree with him or her. If everybody's not equally capable, and if everybody should not be equally participating, what does it matter if you can get a majority of unequal and incapable people of supporting you? So even to have the idea of democracy as the foundation for a political system, as a method and practice for doing governance, as the basis for, say, a republican society, the only way to be able to view democracy in that way, as the foundation and basis of a political system for governing, is to start with the premise that everybody living in that society is, in fact, equal. What I want to suggest is that thinking about democracy that way, as a political practice, as a process and method for doing government, was in fact a radical break with the idea of what democracy meant prior to the Declaration of Independence. The idea of democracy existed prior to 1776, but it didn't mean a practice or a method for doing governance. So I want to talk a little bit about what it did mean and how the revolution changed that and what that and the implications of that meant. So if democracy did not mean a process or a method for doing governance and politics, what did it mean prior to this radical conception that all people were and should be considered to be equal? What democracy was, in the thinking of the British people living in the 13 colonies and the people living in Britain, in fact, in the thinking of Western political thought going all the way back to the ancient Greeks and Aristotle, what democracy was just simply one part of a population. Aristotle, who is the foundation for all of Western political thought that the revolutionaries were drawing upon, and the British political thinkers they were influenced by, had argued that all human societies were evenly divided between three groups: the one, the few, and the many. And the demos, the democracy, was the many. Democracy was not a process for doing politics. It was simply one part of a population. And when you think about it that way, what you understand is that the fundamental implication of people like Aristotle, and then going all the way up to 1776, was that in fact all people were created unequal. That fundamentally and naturally, the godly universe that was inspired by God's creation was not a place of equality, but a place of inequality. Which is why the many, the demos, the democracy, could be separated from the one and the few, who were in fact superior to and had a particular role to play in governing a society precisely because they were not part of the people, were not the many. And therefore, if the majority, the many, wanted something, and if the one and the few felt that it was a bad idea and disapproved of it, that could be enough to prevent it from happening. The majority didn't rule because, in fact, getting a majority of people to support you wasn't essential and fundamental if all people were fundamentally not equal. So why exactly were the one and the few? What role should they be playing in politics? And what role did they play in the lives of the British American colonists who in 1776 decided to break with this past and call all people equal? What Aristotle would argue was that the one, the few, and the many each had virtues, values they brought to a well-ordered political society, but also vices. And if each one of those in isolation was allowed to function without the control and check of the other, the one, the few, and the many, they would become dangerous. But if all three were blended together harmoniously, their virtues would come to the fore and their vices would be limited. So what were the virtues and vices of each? For the one, said Aristotle, the virtue was authority and power, the ability to get things done, strength of will, commitment, a great king or military leader. The problem, of course, was that if unchecked, a great king or military leader with great power could become tyrannical, could begin to abuse his power. And so while great power and direction was needed in any well-functioning political society, what the one needed to do was be balanced by the other two elements, the few and the many. So what were the virtues and vices of the few? The few brought wisdom, capacity, intelligence, achievement. These would be what we would think of in the British 18th century as aristocrats, as peers, as those who would sit in the British House of Lords. Great gentlemen with great achievement, with wealth, with authority, with learning, with high breeding, with intelligence, again, brought to them naturally by their greater capacity than just the great unwashed masses, who could counsel the one, who could guide the one, and who, to a great extent, the one could check his desires and interests by making sure that the few supported what he was doing. The problem, though, of course, was that if the few seized power or unchecked, they could rule based upon their own needs and interests and could become what Aristotle called an oligarchy. And so the few and the one needed to be checked by the demos, the people, the many. Again, the democracy, not a process, but an element within a political society. And with the people, those who were unequal but also committed and necessary and part of society, brought to a well-ordered and balanced political order, was the ideal and love of liberty. After all, if the one and the few were unchecked, it was the many who would be violated. It was the many who would be mistreated. And so what the many wanted to ensure and make happen was that the one and the few never abused their power. And so the political organization of the ancient world, going all the way up into 18th century England, was that the many, the few, the demos, the people, had an important role to play. They should be present, they should be represented. The one and the few would be able to measure and gauge whether they were doing the right thing by the degree to which the many approved. But the many should never be able to rule without the guidance of the one and few. If the many were left unchecked, their desire for liberty would quickly become uncontrolled. They would simply be unable to handle their liberty responsibly, not having the talent and the breeding and the ability of the one and the few. And therefore, their liberty would become anarchy, a complete disorder that would lead to the disintegration of society. And so what Aristotle wanted was a political order that blended together one, few, and many, gave them each a purpose and a role to play, in which all of them could pursue their virtues, strength of will and commitment to achievement, for the one, wisdom and capacity and guidance for the few, the love of liberty for the many, blended together so that all checked each other, and therefore none of their vices could become dominant, either tyrannical power, oligarchic self-interest, or anarchy. Now, that depends upon, therefore, realizing that the majority should not always rule, that there are, in fact, people who are born to be in one, either the one or the few, that most people will never get to be one or few. This is natural, this is ordered, this is godly, this is hierarchical, and should never change. People are not expected to move from one group to the other. And so democracy, in that thinking, is not a process for politics, but one part of a tripartite balanced governing system in which inequality is baked in, to a well-ordered and decent political society. And the reason why Aristotle and this ancient thinking was so important was because what 18th century English-speaking people in both Britain and the 13 colonies believed was that Britain in the 18th century had managed to achieve this wonderful classical balance. With its form of government of a limited constitutional monarchy, a king, the one, a House of Lords, the few, and a representative body, the House of Commons, representing the people, the many, people on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean firmly believed that Britain had solved this great classic Aristotelian riddle, this difficult challenge the ancient world had presented of how to balance properly a decent society. And in the 18th century, and we don't have the time to get into it in great detail, but in the 18th century, as Britain, in fact, triumphed in many, many wars against its archenemy France, and with the great assistance of the North American colonists, consolidated control over much of the Atlantic world, over much of Europe, and over almost all of North America, it seemed to be evidence that they were right. North Americans could become deeply proud of being part of this wonderful British Empire that was triumphing, guaranteeing them liberty and protection and rights. And it seemed that it was doing so because it had managed to balance one, few, and many. They could compare this to, say, France, where an all-powerful absolutist monarch, the one, tyrannically presided over everybody, no balance there. They could compare it to, say, the Dutch Republic or the Italian city-states that had gotten rid of their kings and therefore had fallen into become weaker in the 18th century and been surpassed by Britain. They didn't seem to be well organized and seemed to fall into the problem of the anarchic many. Britain seemed to have this perfect balance. And so the key to understanding why the American Revolution becomes the sharp break that it is because for much of the 18th century, people living in North America, and by people I mean white adult male property owners, thought things were going in the right direction. Britain was winning its wars, it was becoming wealthier than ever, the American colonies were becoming more powerful. It seemed as if this perfect balance had been achieved, and one could look to the British system of governance and point to the ideal. In fact, one of the early American critics of certain British policies, in 1764, a man named James Otis, who lived in Boston, and who becomes an important American revolutionary, said in 1764 that the British Constitution, and by that he meant this balance of king, lords, and commons, one few and many, was the most perfect system ever created by man. So that's a pretty big endorsement. This is James Otis in 1764, who would later become an American revolutionary seeking independence. As of 1764, he saw no reason to do that, though he had certain criticisms of specific British policies. And so what this meant was that as the 18th century developed, American colonists became more confident in their own Britishness and their own belief that Britain had, in fact, resolved and solved fundamental problems of how to order a balanced society well. And fundamentally what they thought Britain did well was it protected the liberty of the right to property. And for British-speaking people in the 18th century, liberty, freedom, and property were very much intertwined. The argument was that you could not really be in possession of liberty unless you were free from the constraints and controls and authority of other people. And the only way to be truly free from the constraints and controls and authority of other people was to own enough property to sustain yourself and your family. So fundamentally, property was the foundation for a life of liberty. What that meant was that you had to have very careful control over how your government could interfere with your right to property and with your possession of property. And the clearest way that a government might interfere with the right to property would be its power to tax. And today, and as of now, we all know, when a government is taxing us, it is laying claim to a portion of our property. It's saying it has the right to take it from us for public purposes. So obviously, we want to have a lot of control over how that happens, which is why we insist today in our modern world that our elected representatives should have sole authority over determining how taxation works. Well, that comes from this 18th century British insight about the connection of liberty and property. What the British had concluded by the 18th century was that, in fact, it was the representatives of the many, the House of Commons, that should determine the rate and process of taxation. The argument was that was the only way to have the true protection of property that was the foundation for liberty. The argument really went like this, and this is where this notion of no taxation without representation comes from. What the British argued was that taxation could become tyrannical and begin to threaten property if there was not a control over how much property was taxed. And so the way that you could control and limit how much property was taxed was by making sure that two things were true. One, that the taxpayers should be able to choose, elect those who taxed them. And two, that those who actually were responsible for setting the rate of taxation also had to pay the taxes themselves. The thing there was that if they're elected, you can vote them out if you're not happy, and if they have to pay the taxes they're demanding of you, they will never tax you dangerously or hurtfully because they have to pay the taxes as well. When you think about it, that lets out, in Britain, the king and the House of Lords. The king is the state. He, by definition, receives taxes. So he doesn't pay taxes, and of course the king isn't elected. Now in Britain, in the House of Lords, the peers of the realm, the earls, the dukes, and all those, they do pay taxes, but of course this is a world of inequality. They are in their position by right of birth. They are born in these positions. You don't vote out the Duke of Buckingham. You don't vote out an earl. Therefore, they don't meet the second requirement, which is the taxpayers choose. Only the House of Commons, the elected members who also pay taxes, meet this requirement. Now, the problem that really began the American Revolution was that in the 1760s, Britain began to decide to tax its American colonists. The American colonists, who were convinced that they were British too, that they had all the rights of British people, including the right to property, didn't, in fact, send members to the House of Commons. And so here, for the first time, even though the House of Commons was truly representative for people living in Britain, it didn't represent American colonists in the same way. And they became very concerned that Britain was in fact violating its own values, its own commitment to the protection of property. Now, someone like James Otis, who has said that the British government is the best ever conceived by human beings, was convinced that if they just simply pointed this error out, the British would stop. But over the course of the 1760s into the early 1770s, as the taxation continued, and as Britain did not stop taxing, Americans began to lose confidence that the system they thought had worked so well, in fact, worked for them. It seemed that even though Britain appeared to have balanced one few and many effectively, that it hadn't. That the king, the House of Lords, these great and powerful unelected figures had managed to figure out a way to make even the British system an instrument of tyranny and dangerous to property. And that's where we go back to this idea that we hold these truths to be self-evident. Because what do you do if even the British system that you're convinced is the best ever conceived by people lets you down? If it turns out that it, in fact, cannot protect your fundamental liberties and your need for property. This is the argument that Thomas Paine made very famously in Common Sense, is what the Americans concluded by 1776 was that there was no system of government that will continue to include unelected hereditary officials, one and few, that could ever work effectively. If even the British system had failed, that in fact the problem was with the very idea that Aristotle had proposed in the first place, that one and few could never be limited, could never be tamed, would always find a way to be tyrannical. And if you become convinced of that, then all you have left is the many. And you have to start being able to justify why a government of just the many is legitimate and acceptable. The only way to do that is to start arguing for a notion of radical equality. You have to start arguing, in fact, that one and few are human constructions that are false, that are lies, that are bogus. There is no such thing as one and few. That's what Jefferson's point is. All men are created equal, meaning there can't be hereditary governance. There is no such thing as somebody born to be a duke, born to be a king. There is only the many. And if there's only the many, well, then this conception, this different conception of democracy becomes possible. Because if we're all equally capable and all equally able to participate, then it matters if a larger number of us than a smaller number, if a majority of us is persuaded by something. All of us equally capable people, a majority of us have come to a position, that has significance, that has meaning. Once you've made that move, you can begin to reconceive what democracy is as not one part of a political system, but as the only legitimate process for there being a political system. It's a very radical and subversive challenge to a long-standing conception that the universe is godly and unequal, inspired by God to be unequal. In fact, what you're saying is inspired by God to be equal. And so you're rejecting a long-standing claim about how politics should work. But what I want to suggest, and this is what we'll turn to next, is that that idea is what I call a slippery idea, meaning that it can slide around a lot and be heard and thought about and applied differently by different kinds of people. Because as I'm sure most of you listening to this know, there are all sorts of examples of real-time, real-life, real-world inequality and exploitation and injustice that seem to go against the notion that all people should be treated equally. And I'm going to talk about just three groups briefly. One is ordinary small white male property holders. A second group is white women. And a third group is enslaved black men and women. And how their ability to sort of think about and take up and make use of these radical ideas can have unexpected, unanticipated consequences for what the American Revolution becomes and for the American society that it produces. So when people like Thomas Jefferson wrote what they did and George Washington led an army, they had been presiding over a society that began to look a lot more like Great Britain over the course of the 18th century. It stands to reason. They were part of the British Empire. They were benefiting and succeeding in the way that Britain was. And so what you actually are getting over the course of the 18th century is a society that was more stratified by wealth. You could, by 1776, you could go to any of the 13 colonies and identify a clear ruling class of great, powerful, landed gentlemen. And in many ways, what they were becoming frustrated by in the 1760s and 1770s was that they were not being treated like the British gentlemen they felt they were. Britain seemed to be violating the liberties of people of their status and wealth and achievement and standing. And when you reject one and few, and you argue that in fact there should not be one and few, and therefore what Britain is the British society that is doing this to you is no longer creditable, and you should no longer be subjected to it. What you do is you have to say things like all men are created equal. And as Britain responds by sending armies and trying to prevent you from organizing your new society around that principle, you have to rise up to defend it, which requires calling to your aid and relying upon all sorts of people who you yourself would not have considered part of an elite and gentlemanly society. In many ways, what they were doing, therefore, in rejecting the idea of a fundamental hierarchy and order in British society was they were also potentially undermining the capacity to have any kind of fundamental hierarchy or order in colonial American society, a colonial American society that they themselves were at the top of. And so as the American Revolutionary War, which was very long and protracted and difficult, continued for years and years and years, and as all sorts of small landowning ordinary white men were brought into this process and really their labor was relied upon to make the revolution work, what you get is all kinds of people at the local levels in small places like little towns in New Jersey and New York and Pennsylvania and other places carrying the revolution forward and beginning to develop an intense sense of ownership over the process of the American Revolution, feel that they should continue to be part of the process of governance, and that in fact the very ideas of radical equality, of all men being created equal, should apply to everyday life and fundamentally apply to who gets to make decisions, what kind of decisions get made, and how politics should function. And so if you look at the history of the American Revolutionary Society in the sort of 10 or 12 years after 1776, what you begin to see are radical transformations of how politics is working at the state level. In places like New Jersey, all sorts of ordinary white men, having been liberated from the idea of one and a few, began to reject the idea that people should be elected to government who didn't look like them. You can measure who gets elected to state legislatures in the 1780s and early 1790s, and in virtually every state, what the ordinary small white male property owner is doing is electing men who are poorer, less educated, and closer to the average sort of person like themselves, than they had elected and chosen to follow prior to the revolution. So these ideas, in many ways, begin to slip out of control almost immediately. There begins to be a real conflict over whether the great, wealthy, landowning and mercantile men who presided over colonial American society, as they overthrew the values that justified British elitism, could continue to, in fact, preside over the society they were hoping to lead. But that's just the beginning of the slippery nature of these ideas. I want to talk a little bit about the status of women and how the American Revolution unexpectedly affects it as well. Now, if you live in a world of ordered inequality among men, it's also very easy then to talk about natural inequality between men and women. And fundamentally, in every aspect of British life and law, that inequality was baked into the system. Literally, women were expected to be born into households headed by fathers and then married to households headed by husbands. That the sort of default position of a woman was always to be under the authority of either husband or either father or husband. And this was written into English legal practice as a status called the femme covert, the covered female. A woman before adult age and a married woman did not have a legal identity separate from her husband. But during the American Revolution, this raises this essential kind of tricky question. And let me just put it this way. Can a woman commit treason? What do I mean by this? Well, the American Revolution divides people. There are loyalists. There are people loyal to Britain in the American Revolution. But if a woman is a loyalist, when she has no separate legal identity and is not a responsible adult person, can you punish her for her loyalism? Can you hold her accountable for her decision-making? Well, you better need to, because the revolution is a touch-and-go affair. You need the support of everybody, and you need to disincentivize what you consider bad behavior. You have no choice but to acknowledge that when women do things either for the revolution or against the revolution, it has consequences. You want to maximize how many women are supporting the revolution, and they can support it in any number of ways. When their husbands go off to war, they maintain the farm. They sew uniforms. They help with the manufacturing that allows for the building, the construction of muskets and powder and shot. All kinds of ways in which they can feed, house, and clothe the revolutionary movement. You want to maximize that behavior and disincentivize and discourage behavior that might undermine the revolutionary movement. But the only way that you can, in fact, do that is by acknowledging that women are political beings who have positions, and if you have to appeal to them, you have to convince them, you have to persuade them, and you also have to acknowledge that their decisions will have an impact. And so what you see, astonishingly, during the revolution is revolutionary state legislatures actually beginning to enact laws directly appealing to women to participate in the revolution. Massachusetts goes so far as to ask women to abandon their husbands if they are loyalists. If their loyalist husbands leave, they ask these women to stay and promise to give them certain property rights if they do. That is a deeply subversive thing to be doing in the conception of gender and relationship of men and women, only done because in this revolutionary movement they cannot afford to lose any support. Now that could either continue to have huge potential subversive ramifications, or as we'll see, you're going to have to respond to it once the revolution is over. But already what women can start to say as they participate in this revolution is, well, this radical conceptions that can overthrow monarchy, which is as central to our thinking as anything else, why can't they also overthrow the status of femme covert? Doesn't the fundamental assumption of inequality that makes monarchy possible also make the status that subordinates women to men possible? It's that mistaken thinking that God has created a naturally unequal universe. Well, You've overthrown huge aspects of it already, and now you're directly appealing to us to participate in the revolution. Why should any aspect of that older thinking of fundamental natural inequality remain and survive? Clearly, then, one of the biggest examples of inequality in 1776 was the huge incident of slavery in the North American colonies. In a population of right around 3 million people, 600,000 of those people were enslaved. But if you think about it, it's much easier to justify and explain slavery if you start with the premise that God has created a fundamentally unequal universe in which people are born into natural conditions of inequality. If you throw off huge aspects of that thinking, if you get rid of the idea of monarchy and aristocracy, which again, we don't think about them much today because we don't live in a monarchy and aristocracy, but those were as central to their thinking as anything else, shape the thinking of colonial America. It's not as if they're incapable of fundamentally rejecting basic institutions. They do. But those basic institutions of inequality that make a king also make a slave a slave. If you no longer have kings, if you no longer have one and few, why can you have any kind of justification for gradations of seemingly natural inequality? How do you continue to justify those things if in fact God has created not an unequal universe, but a universe of equality? And we see this directly. First of all, this language is everywhere. And it slides everywhere. And you can see enslaved peoples, they know about the Declaration of Independence too. They're very aware of the ideas that are driving forward and discrediting the notion that some people can naturally be seen as unequal in positions of subordination to other people. One of the best examples of this is a slave revolt that takes place after the Revolution, but is very much part of the Revolutionary era in Virginia, led by a man named Gabriel, who was a slave in Richmond, Virginia. And when this revolt is violently put down by the government of James Monroe, who will later become president of the United States, who was governor of Virginia at the time, and when the treason and when trials are instituted to punish the slaves who revolted, one of Gabriel's followers at the trial explains his actions by saying that his only justification for rising up in revolt against his slave-owning oppressors would be the same justification that George Washington would have used had the British won and he'd been tried for his actions in a court of treason. So here is a slave in Virginia who can invoke the name of Washington and who can lay claim to an American revolutionary legacy. He too can say he is an American revolutionary. And in many ways what he can say is the same language and the same thinking that justifies George Washington taking the actions he did justifies me taking the actions I am taking. What this means is that this American revolutionary ideology at the time, and these are not things that present-day people with their 21st century values have gone back and imposed on the period. These are ideas that are emerging from the period itself and by the people living in it. The American Revolution is very much an affair that is so vast and so big and so complex that it can be laid claim to by all sorts of different people for very different reasons. Some may define the American Revolution as what Britain is doing to a specific segment of the American colonial population, but a vast many others may define the American Revolution as what certain colonial Americans are doing to other colonial Americans. And so in many ways, what this leads to is a deep desire to draw boundaries around who gets to be part of this radically explosive many. What happens in the decades after the American Revolution is you see a much, much greater emphasis on trying to recreate, refurbish, reestablish much more firmly the lines of race and gender. It's very difficult to ever convince ordinary white men that they should go back to a position of subordination, and no elite American ever manages to do that. What you get increasingly is a conception of the demos, the many, the democracy, as something that involves white men only. And increasingly what you therefore can argue is that while clearly God has made all men equal, and they really can emphasize that statement of Jefferson's, that equality is connected to gender and to skin color. And so what you get, in many ways, is the American revolutionary legacy going forward is those who are left out of the many trying to keep alive the notion that the American Revolution is an ongoing process. They are not, in fact, going against American revolutionary values. They are trying to, in fact, hold the nation to its American revolutionary values. The best example of this is probably something that happens in 1848 called the Seneca Falls Convention, which is known as the first real organized convention of women demanding political rights. And at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, what the women there do is they issue the Declaration of Independence, substituting men for George III. and therefore laying claim to the idea that the inequality between women and men is a violation of the fundamental revolutionary values that were proclaimed in 1776, but have not been fully acted upon as of 1848. You can see the same arguments being made all the way through the 19th century, even up into the 20th century, as people from Frederick Douglass to the Reverend Martin Luther King talk about what they're doing is within an American revolutionary tradition. And so in many ways, I think what we want to do as we sort of come to our 250th anniversary is not lose sight of just how bold and brave and audacious the proclamation that all men are created equal is. What I've tried to suggest to you today is that it is a fundamental rejection, an absolute subversion of the way that politics have been ordered and thought about since the time of the ancient Greeks, and even redefines what we think of as democracy, moving it from being just one aspect of a political society to the only legitimate process for doing politics. At the same time, I think as we really do acknowledge the sort of the bold bravery of that statement, we also have to acknowledge the fear that statement engendered. Fear from people who were afraid that others might define freedom and liberty differently than they did. Fear of those, frankly, who were worried that the radical and subversive ideas they unleashed might result in the loss of their own status. And so I think that what we have to do is we have to both sort of celebrate the bravery, but also do a much, much better job of confronting the fear. What exactly is it that we are afraid of, and why are we afraid of it? All what we would be doing would be pursuing the fundamental commitment to American revolutionary values that began in 1776, but that along the way, from the moment that they were proclaimed, have been pointed out as needing to move in directions where some people have been afraid of having them go. And that balance of bravery and pride, but also acknowledgement of the sources of fear, and doing a better job of handling the fear and getting past the fear and directly confronting the fear is something I think that what we as citizens of the United States need to be doing.